What secrets can a house hold when its owner has spent a lifetime mastering the art of silence? On the southern edge of France, where the mountains descend toward the Mediterranean in a cascade of stone and pine, there exists a villa that was never meant to reveal anything. If you are joining us for the first time, your presence here matters. We are building something slowly, working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and your support allows these stories to continue. Now, let us return to the coast, to the year 1939, to a house that would soon become a fortress of solitude. The summer of that year moved slowly across the Riviera. The beaches were crowded with the last innocent tourists of an era that did not yet know it was ending. In the hills above Roquebrune-Cap-Martin, Villa La Pausa sat in its customary stillness, its pale walls glowing faintly in the August heat. The olive trees surrounding the property had been planted a decade earlier, and now they cast long shadows across the gravel paths. Inside, the shutters were half closed against the afternoon sun. The room smelled of lavender and old books, and somewhere within those walls, Gabrielle Chanel, known to the world as Coco, was making a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was 56 years old. She had built an empire from nothing. She had dressed the most powerful women in Europe. She had taken lovers from the highest ranks of aristocracy. And now, as the newspapers filled with headlines about German mobilization and diplomatic failures, she understood something that many of her contemporaries refused to accept. The world she had conquered was about to disappear. The villa had been a gift, or rather a collaboration, born from her affair with the Duke of Westminster. Hugh Grosvenor, one of the wealthiest men in England, had financed its construction in 1929. The architect, Robert Streitz, had followed Chanel's precise instructions. The house must resemble a convent, not a place of religious devotion, but a place of discipline, order, and deliberate austerity. The walls were thick, the ceilings were beamed with dark wood. The furniture was sparse, carefully chosen, stripped of ornament. There were no gilded mirrors, no excessive draperies, no signs of the lavish wealth that had paid for every stone. This was intentional. Chanel had grown up in an orphanage run by nuns in the town of Aubazine. The corridors of that institution had shaped her aesthetic permanently. The stark whites, the geometric patterns, the obsessive cleanliness that bordered on spiritual purification. When she built La Pausa, she was not escaping her past. She was enshrining it. By the time September arrived, war had been declared. France mobilized, the Riviera emptied, and Chanel made her first withdrawal. She closed her couture house on Rue Cambon, dismissing nearly 4,000 workers with minimal explanation. The official reason was patriotic. Fashion was frivolous in wartime, but those who knew her suspected other motives. She had been locked in a bitter dispute with her workers over wages and unionization. The war provided a convenient exit. At La Pausa, she waited. The house became quieter than it had ever been. The staff was reduced to a skeleton crew. The telephone rarely rang. The automobiles that had once brought weekend guests from Paris and London no longer appeared on the winding road from the village. Chanel walked the gardens alone, pruning the roses herself, eating simple meals, reading late into the night. What was she thinking during those long months of 1940? The historical record offers fragments, but no certainties. We know that she remained at the villa through the fall of France. We know that she watched, from a distance, as the German army swept through the country she had spent her life conquering in a different way. We know that she did not flee to England, despite her connections there. We know that she did not join the resistance, despite opportunities to do so. And we know that sometime in the early years of the occupation, she made contact with a man named Hans Günther von Dinklage. He was a German diplomat, 13 years her junior, with a charming manner and a complicated past. He had worked in intelligence. He had connections to the highest levels of the Nazi regime, and he would become her companion for the duration of the war, a relationship that would later be described as romantic by some, strategic by others, and treasonous by those who believed she had crossed an unforgivable line. But in the silence of La Pausa, none of this was yet visible. The villa simply waited, as it had been designed to do. Its thick walls revealed nothing. Its windows reflected only the sky. And Gabrielle Chanel, who had spent her entire life constructing an image of independence and control, began the most secretive chapter of her existence. The land had belonged to olive farmers for generations before Chanel ever saw it. 6 hectares of terraced hillside, fragrant with wild thyme and rosemary, overlooking a coastline that had seduced emperors and exiles for centuries. When the Duke of Westminster brought her here in 1928, she stood at the edge of the property and said nothing for a long time. He mistook her silence for disappointment. It was, in fact, the opposite. She was already designing the house in her mind. Their affair had begun 3 years earlier, introduced by Vera Bate Lombardi at a party in Monte Carlo. Westminster was then the richest man in England, perhaps in all of Europe. He owned more land than some countries. His yacht, the Flying Cloud, was larger than most naval vessels. He hunted wild boar in France, salmon in Scotland, and collected beautiful women the way other men collected paintings. Chanel was not intimidated. She had already survived poverty, abandonment, and the death of the only man she claimed to have truly loved, Boy Capel, killed in an automobile accident in 1919. Westminster offered her wealth and access, but she did not need his money. She had her own. What she wanted from him was something more specific: legitimacy. Despite her success, despite dressing duchesses and princesses, despite her perfume becoming the most recognized scent in the world, Chanel remained an outsider to the aristocratic circles she served. She was a dressmaker, a shopkeeper's daughter, or so she claimed. The truth of her origins was already buried under layers of carefully constructed mythology. Westminster could open doors that money alone could not. For 6 years, they conducted their affair across the capitals of Europe. She joined him on the Flying Cloud, cruising the Mediterranean with Winston Churchill and other luminaries of the British establishment. She stayed at Eaton Hall, his ancestral estate, and learned the rituals of English country life: the hunting, the rigid meal times, the elaborate protocols of class. She absorbed everything, studying the aristocracy the way she had once studied the nuns at Aubazine. And she rejected what did not suit her. The Duke proposed marriage repeatedly. She refused each time. The reasons she gave varied depending on the audience. To some, she said that she would not become the 3rd Duchess of Westminster. There had been 2 before her, and she would not be a number. To others, she claimed that marriage would compromise her independence. But there was another reason, unspoken, and perhaps more fundamental. She could not give him an heir. She was already in her mid-40s when they met. The Duke needed a son to inherit his title and his fortune. This biological fact hung over their relationship like a sentence already written. La Pausa was, in some ways, a consolation. If she could not be his wife, she could build something permanent with his money, a monument to her own taste, constructed according to her own vision, on land that would belong to her alone. The Duke understood this transaction and accepted it. He paid for everything: the acquisition of the property, the construction of the house, the landscaping of the gardens. The final cost exceeded 2 million francs, an enormous sum at the time. And when the house was finished, he was merely a guest in it. The architect, Robert Streitz, had trained in the neoclassical tradition, but Chanel pushed him towards something starker. She brought him photographs of the abbey at Aubazine, pointing to the stone staircases, the vaulted ceilings, the absence of unnecessary decoration. She wanted the same proportions, the same weight of silence. The staircase at La Pausa was modeled directly on the one she had climbed as a child, an orphan ascending toward an uncertain future. Now she would descend it as a queen. The house was completed in 1930. By then, her empire was at its peak. The perfume business alone generated revenues that dwarfed her couture operation. Chanel No. 5, launched a decade earlier, had become the best-selling fragrance in history. Its success built on a revolutionary proposition, a perfume that smelled like a perfume, not like a single flower. She had signed a contract with the Wertheimer family to handle production and distribution, a deal she would spend the rest of her life regretting and attempting to renegotiate. At La Pausa, she entertained selectively. The guest list read like a catalogue of interwar European culture: Jean Cocteau, Salvador Dalí, Luchino Visconti, Serge Liffard. They came for weekends that stretched into weeks, filling the house with conversation and cigarette smoke. Chanel presided over these gatherings with careful authority, controlling the guest lists, the seating arrangements, the topics of discussion. She did not tolerate boredom or vulgarity. Guests who disappointed her were not invited back. But even during these crowded summers, there were hours when she walked the grounds alone, inspecting the olive trees, deadheading the roses, checking that the gardeners had followed her instructions precisely. The lavender had to be trimmed at a specific angle. The gravel paths had to be raked each morning before anyone woke. The shutters had to be painted the exact shade of grey-green she had specified, the color of olive leaves in certain light. This obsession with control extended to every aspect of her life. She supervised the kitchens, approving menus days in advance. She arranged the furniture herself, moving pieces by inches until the proportions satisfied her. She kept the same schedule regardless of guests, rising early, working through the morning, resting in the afternoon, appearing for dinner in simple black dresses that cost more than most workers earned in a year. The Duke of Westminster married another woman in 1930. Loelia Ponsonby was young, aristocratic, and capable of producing the air that Chanel could not. The news reached La Pausa by telegram, and those who were present later recalled that Chanel received it without visible emotion. She folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and continued her conversation as if nothing had happened. That evening she dined alone in her room. Their affair did not end cleanly. Westminster continued to visit, sometimes with his new wife, sometimes without. The triangle persisted for years, fueled by habit and genuine affection, and the particular cruelty that wealthy people inflict on each other when they have nothing left to lose. Chanel kept his photographs in her private rooms. She never removed them, even after his death in 1953. Whatever she felt for him, love, resentment, gratitude, contempt, she kept it locked behind the same impenetrable facade she showed the world. By the mid-1930s, La Pausa had become her refuge from an increasingly unstable world. The Depression had damaged her business less than others, but the political situation in Europe cast a shadow over everything. She had always been conservative in her politics, suspicious of socialism, contemptuous of the labor movements that periodically disrupted her ateliers. Now, as fascism rose in Italy and Germany, she watched with an ambivalence that would later prove damaging to her reputation. Her social circle during these years included figures whose politics ranged from reactionary to openly fascist. She dined with Italian aristocrats who supported Mussolini. She maintained friendships with members of the French right, who saw Hitler as a bulwark against Bolshevism. This was not unusual for someone of her class and generation. Many wealthy Europeans viewed the dictatorships as distasteful, but necessary alternatives to communist revolution. But Chanel's associations would prove deeper and more compromising than most. In 1936, she traveled to Germany at the invitation of the government. The official purpose was to visit the Berlin Olympics, but she also toured factories and met with officials who were eager to cultivate relationships with influential foreigners. What she thought of what she saw remains unknown. She left no diary, no letters describing her impressions. She simply returned to Paris and continued her work, designing collections that grew simpler and more severe as the decade darkened. At La Pausa, she began to spend longer periods alone. The guest lists shortened. The parties grew quieter. She developed routines that bordered on ritual, the same breakfast each morning, the same walk through the gardens at the same hour, the same chair on the terrace where she read until the light failed. The servants learned not to disturb her during these solitary hours. They moved through the house like ghosts, maintaining the perfection she demanded without ever being seen. The war, when it finally came, seemed almost a relief. The tension of waiting was over. Now there was only the reality to be managed, and Chanel had spent her entire life managing realities that others found unbearable. She closed her business with the efficiency of someone who had always known this moment would arrive. The seamstresses were dismissed. The fabric was stored. The doors on Rue Cambon were locked, though the boutique selling perfume and accessories remained open. Even in war, women wanted to smell beautiful. She remained in Paris through the fall of France, watching the German army march down the Champs-Élysées from her windows at the Ritz. The hotel had been requisitioned by the Wehrmacht, but Chanel was permitted to keep her suite, a privilege granted to few civilians and one that would later require explanation. She claimed that she simply refused to leave, that her presence predated the occupation and therefore transcended it. The Germans, perhaps amused by her audacity, allowed her to stay. But Paris under occupation was not the Paris she had conquered. The streets were quieter. The restaurants served ersatz coffee and suspicious meat. The curfews emptied the boulevards by nightfall. And everywhere the presence of the occupiers reminded her that power had shifted to forces she could not charm or outmaneuver. For the first time in decades, Chanel was not the most important person in any room she entered. She retreated to La Pausa whenever travel restrictions permitted. The Riviera was technically in the unoccupied zone until 1942, governed by the Vichy regime, rather than directly by Berlin. This distinction mattered less than it seemed. Vichy collaborated enthusiastically with German demands, but it provided a thin fiction of normalcy. At the villa, Chanel could pretend that nothing had fundamentally changed. The olive trees still bloomed. The Mediterranean still glittered below the terraces. The servants still maintained the gardens, according to her precise instructions. It was during one of these retreats that she deepened her acquaintance with Hans Günther von Dinklage. They had met before the war in social circumstances that remain unclear. He was a fixture of the international set that moved between Paris, London, and the Riviera, charming, multilingual, comfortable in aristocratic circles, despite his relatively modest origins. He was also, as Chanel certainly knew, a German intelligence officer with connections to the Abwehr, the military intelligence service. Von Dinklage was known to his friends as Spatz, sparrow in German, a nickname that belied his considerable abilities. He had served in the German embassy in Paris before the war, officially as a cultural attaché, unofficially as a gatherer of information and cultivator of useful relationships. His targets were the influential, the wealthy, the socially prominent, exactly the circles in which Chanel moved. Whether their initial meeting was coincidence or calculation remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding their relationship. He was tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, and possessed of the easy charm that certain men deploy like a weapon. He spoke French without accent. He knew art, music, literature. He could discuss fashion with apparent genuine interest, a rare quality in men of his background. And he was, at 56, when they became lovers, still handsome in the weathered way of men who have lived well and dangerously. Chanel was 60. She had not taken a serious lover in years. The relationship provided immediate practical benefits. With Spatz at her side, Chanel could navigate the occupied city with fewer restrictions. She could travel between Paris and the Riviera when others could not. She could maintain her suite at the Ritz while other long-term residents were expelled. She could conduct business, limited as it was, without the constant harassment that other French citizens endured. These privileges did not go unnoticed. Her contemporaries whispered. Her rivals took note. But Chanel had never concerned herself with the opinions of those she considered beneath her. What she felt for von Dinklage beyond convenience is more difficult to assess. She kept him close throughout the occupation, sharing her table, her bed, her retreat at La Pause. After the war, she would claim that he was merely a friend, that their relationship had been misunderstood, that she had never collaborated with the Germans in any meaningful sense. These denials convinced few people. The evidence, circumstantial but substantial, suggested something more complicated. In 1943, Chanel became involved in an operation that would later be codenamed Model Hut, Model Hat in German. The details remain partially obscured by destroyed documents and conflicting testimonies, but the outline is clear enough. Chanel proposed to use her connections to British aristocracy, particularly her old friendship with Winston Churchill, to explore the possibility of a negotiated peace between Germany and England. She would travel to Madrid, contact the British ambassador, and convey messages from certain German officials who believed the war was already lost. The scheme was fantastical, rooted in a profound misunderstanding of both British resolve and her own importance. Churchill had no intention of negotiating with Hitler. The ambassador in Madrid would not have received her, even if she had managed to reach him. And the German officials backing the operation were themselves engaged in factional intrigues that had nothing to do with genuine peace efforts. But Chanel apparently believed she could succeed where diplomats and generals had failed. Her arrogance, which had served her so well in fashion, betrayed her completely in espionage. She traveled to Madrid in late 1943, accompanied by a former employee named Vera Bate Lombardi, the same woman who had introduced her to the Duke of Westminster years earlier. Vera had married an Italian fascist and was now being used, willingly or not, as a pawn in German intelligence operations. The mission failed almost immediately. Vera, whether from conscience or calculation, refused to cooperate fully. The British were alerted to the operation and dismissed it as the amateur effort it was. Chanel returned to Paris with nothing accomplished. The episode would have remained buried in classified files, if not for documents discovered decades later in French and German archives. When the evidence became public in the 1990s, it confirmed what many had long suspected. Chanel had not merely survived the occupation through luck and charm. She had actively engaged with German intelligence, offering her services, her connections, her willingness to betray old friendships for purposes that remain murky even now. At La Pause, none of this drama was visible. The villa maintained its serene indifference to history. The gardens continued to bloom according to their seasonal rhythms. The servants continued their silent routines. And Chanel, when she was in residence, continued her own rituals of solitude and control. She walked the terraces at dusk. She arranged flowers in the precise vases she had chosen years earlier. She dined alone or with Spatz, speaking of subjects that no one else ever heard. The war ground toward its conclusion. By 1944, everyone who was paying attention knew that Germany would lose. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June confirmed what the Eastern Front had already demonstrated. The Reich was dying, slowly and violently. In Paris, the resistance grew bolder. Collaborators began to calculate their exits. And Chanel, who had calculated her entire life, must have understood that a reckoning was coming. She was arrested briefly after the liberation, questioned about her relationship with von Dinklage and her activities during the occupation. The interrogation lasted only a few hours. She was released without charges, a leniency that sparked immediate speculation. Some attributed it to intervention by Churchill himself, grateful for old kindnesses, or unwilling to see a friend publicly humiliated. Others suggested that she possessed compromising information about prominent figures who preferred her silence to her testimony. The truth, like so much about Chanel, remains inaccessible. What followed the liberation was a kind of exile, though Chanel would never have used that word. She left France in 1945, traveling to Switzerland with von Dinklage, settling eventually in Lausanne. The official explanation was that she needed rest, that the war had exhausted her, that she wished to escape the chaos of post-war Paris. The unofficial explanation was simpler. France had become inhospitable to those who had accommodated themselves too comfortably to German rule. Switzerland offered neutrality in more than the political sense. It was a place where questions were not asked, where wealth provided insulation from judgment, where the past could be reconstructed according to one's preferences. Chanel installed herself in a suite at the Beau Rivage Palace Hotel, overlooking Lake Geneva, and began the long process of rewriting her history. The collaboration, she insisted, to the few journalists who sought her out, had been exaggerated by enemies. The affair with von Dinklage had been a private matter, irrelevant to politics. She had done nothing wrong, nothing at least, that others in her position had not also done. Spatz remained with her, though their relationship evolved into something more ambiguous than romance. He was useful, he was familiar. He required nothing from her that she was unwilling to give. They lived in adjacent suites, dined together most evenings, traveled occasionally to the mountains or the Italian lakes. Whether they still shared a bed, no one knew, and Chanel never said. She was 70 years old. The imperatives of passion had yielded to the comforts of routine. La Pausa stood empty during these years. The villa had survived the war physically intact. The Riviera had seen relatively little fighting, but it felt abandoned in a deeper sense. The gardens grew unkempt. The furniture gathered dust beneath white sheets. The shutters remained closed against a sun that no longer had anyone to warm. Chanel paid for minimal maintenance, enough to prevent decay, but she did not visit. The house had become associated with a chapter of her life she preferred to forget. In 1953, she made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She would return to fashion. The Couture house on Rue Cambon had been closed for 14 years. A generation of women had grown up without knowing her work firsthand. The fashion world had moved on, dominated now by Christian Dior and his extravagant new look. The cinched waists, the full skirts, the elaborate construction that Chanel had always despised. She was 71 years old. The conventional wisdom held that her moment had passed. She proved the conventional wisdom wrong. The comeback show in February 1954 was initially savaged by the French press, who saw her simple suits and easy silhouettes as relics of a bygone era. But the American buyers understood immediately what the French critics missed. Chanel was offering liberation. Her clothes moved with the body rather than constraining it. They could be worn from morning to evening without requiring a lady's maid to adjust them. They were, in a word, she would have rejected as too casual. Practical, eh? Within 2 years, she had reclaimed her position at the summit of French fashion. The Chanel suit, collarless jacket, slim skirt, braided trim, became the uniform of a new generation of powerful women. Jackie Kennedy wore it. Grace Kelly wore it. Every woman who aspired to their elegance wore copies produced in factories around the world. The comeback was complete, and with it came a rehabilitation of her reputation that the war years had nearly destroyed. But she did not return to La Pausa. The villa remained in her possession, but she never again slept under its roof. When asked about it, she deflected with vague references to the difficulty of travel, the demands of her work, the preference for her Paris apartment on Rue Cambon. The truth, those close to her suspected, was that the house held too many memories she could not control. Westminster was dead. Spats had faded into the background of her life, eventually dying in obscurity on Mallorca. The friends who had filled those rooms in the 1930s were gone, scattered by war and time and the natural attrition of aging. In 1964, she sold La Pausa to Emery Reeves, a Hungarian-born publisher who had made his fortune representing Winston Churchill's literary interests. The irony was not lost on observers. The house built with one English fortune now passed to a man enriched by another English titan, one who had perhaps saved Chanel from the consequences of her wartime choices. Reeves and his wife, the model Wendy Russell, filled the villa with an extraordinary art collection. Renoirs, Manets, Cézanne, transforming its austere spaces into something closer to a museum than a home. Chanel took the money and never looked back. She was 81 years old and had finally severed her connection to the Riviera, to the decade of the 30s, to the version of herself that had loved and compromised and survived. What remained was work. She returned to her apartment above the boutique, to the mirrors and the scissors and the endless fittings. She worked until she could no longer stand. The apartment on Rue Cambon became her final fortress. 3 small rooms above the boutique, connected by a private staircase to the salon, where she conducted fittings. The decor was dense, almost claustrophobic. Coromandel screens, crystal chandeliers, bronze animals, stacks of books she claimed to have read. Every surface was covered. Every object had been chosen with the same fanatical precision she applied to her clothes. And everywhere, mirrors. She had installed them on every wall, at every angle, so that she could observe without being observed, see everything while revealing nothing. She worked 7 days a week, often until midnight. The collections came twice a year, each one requiring thousands of decisions: the width of a lapel, the placement of a pocket, the exact shade of navy that distinguished elegance from vulgarity. She supervised every fitting personally, kneeling on the floor despite her age, pinning fabric with hands that had grown arthritic but never lost their certainty. The models stood motionless for hours while she circled them, frowning, adjusting, occasionally ripping apart an entire garment and starting again. Her staff feared her. She was brutal in her criticisms, dismissive of excuses, contemptuous of anything that fell short of her standards. Seamstresses who had worked for her for decades could be reduced to tears by a single remark. Yet they stayed. The prestige of working for Chanel outweighed the daily humiliations, and occasionally, rarely, she would offer a word of praise that made everything worthwhile. She understood the power of scarcity in approval, as well as in design. The years passed in this relentless rhythm. The 60s brought revolutions she despised: the miniskirt, the youth culture, the rejection of everything she considered civilized. She dismissed the new designers as charlatans, their clothes as costumes for children. Yet her own suits continued to sell. The women who bought them were not following trends. They were investing in permanence, in the idea that true style existed outside of time. She gave interviews sparingly, and when she did, she lied freely. Her childhood became a romantic fiction of genteel poverty. Her father, who had abandoned her, was transformed into a loving presence, cut short by tragedy. The orphanage became a convent school, where she had been educated among aristocrats. The lovers, the compromises, the war years, all of it was revised, softened, or simply erased. She was writing her own mythology, and she expected the world to accept it without question. Journalists who challenged her version of events were banished. Biographers who dug too deeply found doors closed, sources warned away, access revoked. She maintained control over her narrative with the same ferocity she applied to her hemlines. The truth was, whatever she decided it was, anyone who disagreed was an enemy. Von Dinklage died in 1974 on Mallorca, alone and largely forgotten. Chanel did not attend the funeral, if there was one. She did not speak of him publicly. Whatever had existed between them, love, convenience, mutual exploitation, she buried with the same efficiency she had buried everything else that no longer served her purposes. The past was useful only insofar as it supported the present. The rest was debris to be discarded. Her health declined through the late 60s, though she refused to acknowledge it. She smoked constantly, ate little, slept poorly. The doctors warned her to rest. She ignored them. Work was the only thing that kept her alive, she said, and perhaps she was right. When she stopped working, she would stop existing. The two had become indistinguishable. La Pausa, meanwhile, had entered its second life. The Rêves filled it with treasures that Chanel would have found excessive, the walls crowded with impressionist masterpieces, the rooms cluttered with antiques and curiosities. Winston Churchill visited often in his final years, painting watercolors on the terrace where Chanel had once taken her morning coffee. The villa had become a different place entirely, its austere bones hidden beneath layers of accumulated beauty. Wendy Reeves understood the significance of the house she had acquired. She preserved certain elements: the staircase, the proportions of the main rooms, the view from the terrace, while transforming others beyond recognition. When Emery died in 1981, she began planning to donate the property and its contents to a museum. The collection was too important to be dispersed, she believed. It deserved to be seen. But Chanel knew none of this. By 1971, she had retreated entirely into her apartment, her work, her carefully constructed solitude. The outside world reached her only through newspapers and the reports of her staff. She had outlived almost everyone who had known her in her youth. The friends, the lovers, the rivals, all gone. She was the last witness to her own history, and she guarded that history jealously. On Saturday, January 9th, 1971, she worked as usual. A fitting in the afternoon, dinner alone in her apartment, a walk through the empty salon, checking that everything was in order for the show scheduled for the following week. Her maid helped her to bed. She complained of feeling unwell, but she always complained. It meant nothing. She died in her sleep. The maid found her the next morning, lying peacefully, as if she had simply decided to stop. She was 87 years old. She had been working until the final day. The funeral was held at the Church of the Madeleine, the same church where her memorial for Boy Capel had been held half a century earlier. The pews were filled with models wearing her suits, a final collection displayed on living bodies rather than mannequins. The flowers were white, camellias, her signature bloom, chosen because they had no scent and therefore could not compete with her perfume. Even in death she controlled the details. She was buried in Lausanne, not Paris. The choice surprised those who expected her to rest in the city she had conquered, but it made a certain sense. Switzerland had sheltered her during her years of exile. It was neutral ground, a place without history, without judgment. Her tomb in the Bois de Vaux cemetery is marked by a simple headstone, decorated with 5 carved lions. Her zodiac sign, the symbol she had incorporated into so many of her designs. Visitors still leave flowers there, and occasionally small bottles of perfume. La Pausa passed through other hands after the Reeves. Wendy donated the art collection to the Dallas Museum of Art, but the villa itself remained in private ownership, changing hands among the wealthy and discreet who valued its privacy and its provenance. The house that Chanel had built as a monument to her own taste became a trophy, traded among collectors who appreciated its history without necessarily understanding it. In 2015, the property was purchased by the Chanel company itself, a corporate homecoming that Coco herself might have viewed with ambivalence. The brand she had created had grown into a global empire worth billions, controlled by others, shaped by designers who had never known her. Karl Lagerfeld, who led the house for decades, occasionally referenced La Pausa in his collections, paying homage to a woman he had never met, but whose shadow he worked beneath until his own death. The villa today remains closed to the public. Its gardens have been restored to something approximating their original design. The olive trees that Chanel planted nearly a century ago still stand, gnarled and ancient, producing fruit each autumn. The lavender is trimmed at the angle she specified. The gravel paths are raked each morning. The house maintains its silence, revealing nothing to the curious, who occasionally drive up the winding road hoping for a glimpse. What remains of Gabrielle Chanel is not the woman, but the image. The pursed lips, the pearls, the cigarette held at a precise angle. The collaborator has been forgotten, or at least forgiven. The lover of Nazis has been overshadowed by the designer of suits. History has performed the revision that she always demanded, smoothing the contradictions, erasing the inconvenient facts, leaving only the legend. La Pausa keeps its secrets. The walls that witnessed her affair with Westminster, her solitude during the war, her calculations and compromises, say nothing. The terrace where she watched the Mediterranean holds no memory of the woman who stood there. The staircase modeled on her orphanage childhood leads only to empty rooms. Perhaps this is the legacy she would have chosen. Not truth, but control. Not confession, but silence. The house she built to resemble a convent became in the end exactly that. A place of discipline, order, and the deliberate absence of revelation. Whatever sins were committed there, whatever prayers were offered, remain between Chanel and the thick stone walls she raised against a world that was never permitted to see her clearly. The Mediterranean continues its ancient rhythm below the cliffs. The seasons turn, the olives ripen and fall, and Villa La Pausa waits, as it has always waited, for visitors who will never be received.